Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Very, very strange not to be able to see anyone's faces, but we will get started. So welcome to there's with a clicker that has now suddenly stopped working. There we go. Welcome to the Anti-Dull webinar. So as I said, we will get started in a second, but just getting into the subject of why marketing perhaps might be so dull and what we can do about it. But before we do, we'd just like to do three things. So number one, most importantly, we would really like to hear your questions. So if you have any interesting questions, anything you'd like us to sort of expand on further, please do stick them in the comments, and time permitting, and if we feel able to answer the questions, we will come back to them at the end. Number two, really importantly, we're going to introduce ourselves. So hello, I am Toby Brown. I'm a strategy director at eatbigfish. So I'm going to take us up to about the middle of this webinar, about the sort of 20 minute mark. At that point, probably you'll begin to think I'm a little bit dull, I'm a little bit boring. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Susie, who's sitting right here. And then we will, Susie will take us through to the end, and yeah, time permitting, we will do some questions. Number three, we want to make sure we are crediting the authors of this sort of new emergent thinking. So firstly, our founder, Adam Morgan, whose podcast, Let's Make This More Interesting, absolutely worth checking out, fired the starting gun on all of this thinking. Secondly, Peter Field, who's conducted all of the early foundational work on this idea using the IPA database. And then finally, John Evans and System One, who brought their own unique experience and a whole new data set to the conversation. So thank you to all three of those. So back to the exam question. So you might be thinking this is quite a bold claim, and of course it is deliberately hyperbolic. But if we asked you to reflect on the most interesting piece of marketing that you've seen today, perhaps, how long would it take you to think of something? If, of course, you discount your own brand or the client project that you're currently working on. Probably a little bit longer than you'd expect. Normally, when we ask this question in a room full of actual real live human beings, we get a lot of blank faces, a lot of worried looks, as though we might be about to call on someone. Of course, we're not going to. It's just a rhetorical question. But it is surprising that people struggle to answer that really, really quickly, because on average, we see sort of between 1 and 200 ads a day, and who knows how much more content that would sort of broadly be classified as marketing. So with all of that we're sort of, subject to every day, one would hope that a little bit more of that is sticking in our minds. And of course, this is anecdotal, but the evidence backs this up. It suggests that, in fact, it is not. We are right in not being able to remember anything exciting that we've seen today. About half of all marketing, according to System One's data, leaves us feeling nothing. So essentially, is so dull that we can't even remember it. Feel nothing, do nothing. So what's going on? What is driving that? Because, of course, none of us are setting out to be dull. I think, it's probably the reason we all chose to work in this industry, precisely because it's an interesting place. It should be allowing us to do really exciting things, but dull is still creeping in. Why is that happening? Well, Daniel Kahneman would probably say that this is down to our sort of, the way our brains are wired, our genetic heritage. They're designed in a world, they've evolved in a world, where doing new things, trying unusual things, taking a less beaten path might well get you eaten by a tiger. So our brains are naturally wired to sort of, encourage us to be risk adverse, to stick with what we know, stick with the conventional. And it's not just, our genetic heritage, it's not our brain's fault. Our organizations that we create then sort of go on to sort of compound and reinforce this kind of thinking. They incentivize, or tend to incentivize, playing it safe, what we call path dependency. So if this is the context in which we are trying to be more interesting, what we've done with this piece of work is try and short circuit that. Instead of sort of fighting against this innate tendency, what we've tried to do is leverage that sort of tendency to sort of avoid dull by trying to make the cost and risk of being dull far more visible. So as we mentioned, this is kind of new thinking. It's quite tricky to do. Up until now, no one's really been measuring whether marketing is interesting or dull, which perhaps in of itself is quite telling. So what we've had to do is use proxies. So System One, as you've seen, have used our emotional response to ads, a lack of emotional response equating with dull. And Peter has used sort of rational, fact-based campaigns as a proxy for dull, and emotional fame-generating campaigns as a proxy for being interesting. So we'd be the first to admit, not yet perfect, but I think robust enough to begin to draw conclusions from. And we would say those conclusions are really interesting. It seems like being dull tends to sort of, approximately cost twice as much as being interesting. Or if you're a stickler for being traditional, we'd say being interesting gets you roughly twice the bang for your buck. So whichever way you want to look at it, with the resources sort of available to you, it's a pretty big deal. It's potentially a pretty big multiplier. And of course, when you look at this way, it's clear that this is really, or potentially, a choice. And of course, if you're an incumbent with deep pockets, then being dull might not be a problem. You can afford to take the hit. And why would you change things up in order to raise the bar for what interesting looks like unnecessarily? This is already working for you. It makes sense to keep it the way it is. But if you're a challenger, defined as having ambitions that outweigh your sort of readily available resources, then spending your way to success isn't an option, and this status quo isn't going to serve you. So they, challengers, and probably all of us, in fact, need to do more with less. Being dull or being interesting isn't really a choice. Being interesting is an imperative. And if that's the case, then really we'd argue that being interesting isn't a creative problem. Being dull isn't a creative problem. It's a strategic problem. To sort of hugely sort of paraphrase Vicky Ross when she was talking about the problem of AI in our world, we would absolutely argue that sort of bland inputs lead to bland outputs. It's as much about the inputs as it is about the outputs. So what we're going to do in this is we're going to look back upstream, look at the strategic root causes of dull that in our experience tend to make those dull outcomes that we want to avoid all the more likely, perhaps even inevitable. We're going to run through 5 questions that we always ask our clients, and we're asking us to ask ourselves, and see if we think the brand that we're currently working on or the brands that we're responsible for have that capacity to be more interesting. And then we're going to look at 5 sort of upstream challenger solutions to help sort of create strategies that will help us avoid that trap of being dull. So on to the first. Are we talking to our customer, or are we talking to, in fact, ourselves? 56% of people, much bigger number, can't think of a single brand that they feel connected with or that understands them. And 75% of brands wouldn't be missed if they disappeared overnight, which is quite staggering. Why is this? So Mary Wells Lawrence, the famous advertising pioneer, speaking 50 years ago, said that too many ads are cold, too filled with jargon, and they're not talking to their customers. And, obviously the situation in advertising, one would hope, has improved since then, but we would say there's still a very long way to go, especially when you look below the line at sort of more marketing more broadly. What's causing this? And what might we do about it? Well, the very obvious answer is that what we really need to do is get much closer to our customer, understand them really well, and then be able to talk to them on their terms. And it's really obvious, but it doesn't, in our experience, happen all that often. Why isn't it happening? And I think probably the most clear reason in our experience is that this tends to be a byproduct of success, that getting bigger often means getting blander. When you're a small business, starting out perhaps, having a one-on-one relationship with your customer, it's quite easy to get close to them. It's quite easy to understand them. But as you grow, as you become more successful with this beautiful animation, you, as you set out to do, begin to get more customers. The challenge with this is the more customers you have, the more generic your insights about them tend to become. In fact, quite often they become what we would call observations rather than insights. And what you have to begin to do is start relying on intermediaries to begin to filter all this information from all of your newly found customers into a way that you as an individual or as an organization are able to digest. And this pressure towards bland then compounds. Your appetite for further growth means you have to cast the net even wider, and you start to try and become a brand for everyone. So as Guy Kawasaki, formerly of Apple, now of Canva, would say, most companies want to create the holy grail of products, appealing to every demographic, social, economic background, and geographic location. But to attempt to do this guarantees mediocrity. So what do we do about that, and why is that happening? Because, of course, challengers are as hungry for growth as anyone else, but they also understand that trying to be for everyone is a very risky game to play. Because the more opinions you ask, the more you try to appeal to a broader audience, the more the edges of interesting get knocked off. And of course, people stop hating you as a result. You've knocked off the bits that they were rejecting in the first place. But those tend to be the bits that somebody else somewhere else really, really loved. And as you've got rid of those and now no one hating you, and that's great, also nobody really loves you either. No one really, really cares. What we really want you, as for a challenger, is for some people to love you lots, even at the expense of some people not really getting it and rejecting it. Essentially, we would argue that what you need to be is unapologetically clear about who you are for, but also really usefully understanding who you are not for. You need to divide the world. A great example of this is Gymshark. They are unapologetically for gym people. If you know, you know. If you don't, that's fine. This is not for you. For example, this ad, we made stringers a thing. Now, not all of us are going to know what stringers are. I certainly didn't. For those who don't, it's a vest that shows off the nipples, the best effect. That is the stringer. But this is adverts quite clearly speaking to a cohort who understand that, not the people who don't. On the flip side of the coin, over the pond, Planet Fitness are talking to the exact opposite audience. So they aren't for gym people. They would call these people lunks, even to the extent of having a button in their gyms that if you press will get a misbehaving lunk thrown out. So they really overcommit to this principle. They have a lunk alarm here. This is a target mindset, and it should inform more than just your comms. So it's been central to Sit & Zen design and service philosophy. They are very proudly for the kind of person who takes the train but drinks champagne, the kind of person who doesn't want some things, is willing to sacrifice some things, as long as those things that really matter to them, are as good as they possibly can be. And of course, done right, this isn't about constraining who you sell to with a really niche demographic or cohort. This is about creating both products and services with a really tight understanding of your mindset, a mindset that then has a much broader and commercially viable sort of set of people that it will, be aspirational to, will inspire. So giving you a really clear design target allows you to be so interesting that you will then appeal to a much broader audience. So that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about sort of a niche sort of demographic target. So the thing we would always sort of work on our clients with is being unapologetically clear about who you're for, who you are not for, so you are then able to really meet them where they care. Because of course, it is the truth, as much as we would not like it to be, that our customers, broadly speaking, really don't care about us. They don't care about our products and services. They care about themselves, their dreams, and their goals. So if you really understand who they are, who they aspire to be, you can then have a much more interesting and rich conversation about that, not about yourself. So know who you're for. You know who you're for, sorry. What is the next stage? What do you then go on to say to them? That brings us to our second question. Are we being distinctive, or are we blending into the background? So all of these brands here, all of these products would almost certainly consider themselves to have distinctive assets, from their logo, the shape of their bottle, the color of the bottle, the color of the bottle top. But of course, from the customer's perspective, they probably aren't seeing this difference. In fact, only 15% of brand assets are truly distinctive, because this isn't what the customer thinks of as being distinctive. This is what the customer thinks of as being distinctive. Their distinctive is not our distinctive. And that's really important, because from our perspective, our products, of course, are really sort of fascinating, endlessly interesting. We understand about all of the effort and work that's gone into the really smaller details. We spend all of our time thinking about them. So we want to then go and tell people all about them. So 3 examples of this in practice. So 3 well-known brands before they had their big break: Halo Top, RX Bar, and Oatly. So Halo Top wanted to tell people that they were all natural, they were from a creamery, they were light, a good source of protein, 7 grams, 4 carbs, and, nearly at the end, 70 calories a serving. But of course, people weren't really interested in all of that. So just before their reboot, they were scraping along at something like sort of $12,000 of annual sales, a lot less than they are now. RX Bar wanted people to know they were also all natural, 12 grams of protein, no gluten, no GMOs or soy or dairy, and then the really tiny little voice that you probably can't see on your screen that they were also no bullshit. And then finally, Oatly, before their big sort of reinvention, they wanted to tell you that they were healthy, they were dairy-free, packed full of calcium, full of vitamins, they had fiber, they'd lower your cholesterol, and, a second mention of calcium in there and vitamins, because, the insight reports from all of those customers said that was really important in the dairy alternative category. And also, sales of 20 million, sort of not bad for the size of the Swedish market, but not even close to their eventual potential. So what do you do about this? Well, John York, when we spoke to him as part of the Let's Make This More Interesting podcast, said there's a really easy shorthand for this. It is to do what Dickens did. It is to take a characteristic of your character and really lean into it, really exaggerate it. A little bit like making the logo bigger, but not. So here are the reinventions. So Halo Top, lent into that calorie story. So they talked about being an ice cream with 290 calories per pint, and that has taken them to something like $600 million annual sales. RX Bar talked about being 4 ingredients and no bullshit, quite clearly there on the front of the pack. And then Oatly talked about sort of, being sort of wow, no cow, and sort of, the related sort of CO2 savings, not on the front of the pack, but very prominently on the side, and of course, in all of their marketing that surrounded that. And of course, the challenge is, this is very easy to say in this room, on this webinar, but of course, this is really hard. People are always going to say, but don't we need to talk about this, talk about that? Received wisdom is always going to tell you that lots and lots of things are really important. They're all there for a reason, because a focus group has told us that people really care about it, or because somebody else within our organization or a competitor claims it's really important. But more important than any of those things, we would argue, is just getting noticed. So what you need to do is figure out what will break through the noise of your category, and then really overcommit to that. And then test for that thing. Is your innovation, is your refinement breaking through the noise? Is it getting noticed? Do some people love it? Do some people hate it? But most importantly, are they interested in it? Are they thinking about that? And of course, the other thing that we often come up against when we're doing this with clients is the sense that, well, I'm not really sure there's something interesting for us to talk about. It's not something really distinctive or compelling. We are yet to find a brand that doesn't have something really interesting or compelling to talk about. And it doesn't have to be something that's conventionally thought of as a positive attribute. So Malort, for example, talk about sort of, the awful taste of their product, which of course is fascinating. It breaks through the noise. It's interesting. It makes you want to try it to see it's as bad as they claim that it is. And in fact, often those sort of equities that aren't immediately obvious are those things that are best, that are most compelling. So the second thing we would ask of our clients, we suggest that we all consider on this call, is, are we trying to say too much? And in doing so, just adding to the noise of the category that's bombarding our customers? Or are we sacrificing to overcommit to that one thing that will really stand out, that will really grab the attention of our audience? So if we know who we're for and who we're not for, and we know what it is that we want to say to them, how can we say it in a way that will make them care? I am now going to hand over to Susie. There you go.
Thank you. You can see our high-tech turning table. Brilliant. So the third, I suppose, strategic choice that we have, or question that we should ask if we are seeking not to be dull, is this one. Are we telling a dramatic story, or are we just being safe? And as marketers and brand owners, we are all obsessed with telling stories. I think lots has been written about how we can tell better stories, stories that put our customers first, stories that grow our business. And I'm sure many of you will have read at least one of these books or something similar in an attempt to be a much better storyteller. And rightly so. Stories, as we all know, evoke emotional responses. I'm not going to kind of lecture you on neuroscience because I know very little about it, but what I do know is that the science tells us this is a good thing for marketing. So neuroscience studies have shown that emotional events trigger a part of your brain called the amygdala, and that boosts memory encoding. It enhances attention and it enhances perception. So very simply, when we tap into people's emotions, the more attention that they pay and the more that they remember. And this is as true for some of the stories we might assume to be less reliant on emotion. So in the world of B2B, for example, research shows that 70% of business leaders feel a greater affinity to a B2B brand when moved on an emotional level. So clearly stories are really important to us as consumers, as marketers, as people. But when we go back to this chart that Toby showed us earlier on in this presentation, if we were telling good stories, these stats we wouldn't be seeing. These wouldn't be true. So something must be broken. Something isn't working. So who better to tell us some stories than Sesame Street? Any kids of the 80s or 90s, this picture will probably bring back lots of happy childhood memories. But on Adam's podcast, Let's Make This More Interesting, he interviews Norman Stiles, the former head writer of Sesame Street. And if you haven't listened, I highly recommend. It's a brilliant conversation. But Norman Stiles told us, if your character doesn't want something, then they're just standing there and they're just talking. If they don't really want or care about what they're talking about, and there isn't some kind of emotion involved in it, then you're just not going to care about it as someone that's watching this or in the audience either. And lots of brands understand this. So, lots of brands recognize and play back the desires of their consumers. So if you're a beer brand, you're probably showing, a scene like this one, demonstrating you understand people want a cold beer with some friends in the sun. If you're a car brand, you know that people want the freedom a car gives them. A travel company, this idyllic scene of relaxation. And burgers, people just want something really delicious to satiate their hunger. But none of these are really interesting stories yet. I think we probably could all agree they're maybe a bit safe. At worst, they're a little bit dull. And actually, that's because there's another element to really good storytelling beyond just showing what someone wants. Good stories introduce tension. And this is something that kind of challengers know really, really well. There needs to be a barrier to the character getting what they want. There needs to be something that stands in their way, something that needs to be overcome. And that's kind of really the resolution of the story that you're telling. So we can take a classic story, boy meets girl, they fall in love, they live happily ever after. It's not particularly interesting. No one's ever made a kind of a best-selling rom-com out of that story. But what if they can't be together? And that's really where the drama comes in. So as John le Carre says here, it's this tension, this kind of why or why not that really makes a good story. So in the stories that we're telling, one question and one choice that we have is, are we just giving people what they want? Or are we introducing some tension in the narrative that really makes people want it even more, something that we have to overcome? So let's go back to holidays. Most of us want something like this, I imagine, from our holidays at some point. Something that pictures kind of relaxation, blue skies, a pool, some nice kind of drinks, something that can really kind of put us at ease and relax us. And this is really what most holiday brands are telling us. It's hard to say no to, but really, is it a bit dull? Is it really going to make you choose one holiday provider over another? And this is a brand that we really love at Eat Big Fish. So Plum Guide are a luxury holiday rental platform. And they know that there's a much more interesting story to be told about holidays. So they know that their consumers want, everything we saw on the previous slide, but they also know that there's something quite critical standing in the way of having these kinds of holidays. And that's time. So rather alarmingly, the drama in this story is not the holiday that you could be going on and how amazing that might be, but really how few holidays you might have left. So somewhat alarmingly, if you're 38, you only have 42 holidays left in your life. And there's nothing like that to kind of really get you thinking about what you want and the brand that you want to connect with. So suddenly Plum Guide are building their brand around a very different story, one that kind of almost introduces this sense of fear and panic. And ultimately urgency. All of these things they overcome with the product they offer. They have a seamless booking system and they have a kind of beautiful set of expertly curated destinations. So you can see how they're kind of introducing this tension. They're making a choice about how they tell this story. And they're telling a much more compelling story that we pay attention to, that we really notice. And of course, this story requires them to do things in a way that has much more urgency, has a much more interesting style of delivery. So, for example, it's one that requires them to dress people as the Grim Reaper, delivering a kind of apocalyptic message on the streets of London. And actually, it's one that's really working for them. So their sales have increased by 175% in a year. And interestingly, they've seen word of mouth double. So, they're telling stories that are interesting enough to share, which I think, as we all know, is something really highly coveted for lots of brands. Another brand that introduces a really interesting tension in the way that they tell their story and they speak to consumers is Backmarket. So Backmarket is a company that refurbs technology. They take kind of old devices and they resell them at lower price, refurbed for consumers. And they take dramatic storytelling to a new level with this kind of recent Tech Reborn campaign. So they're introducing environmental cost as this kind of tension, as the thing that's getting in the way of people kind of satisfying their desire for new devices in the tech space. And they've always talked about this refurb revolution. So they kind of call for this movement, providing a really clear solution to the tension they've created. And what we really love about Backmarket is that this isn't just a tension that's in the story they tell externally. It's actually something that exists in the way that they tell their story internally. So their brand shows up with a real sense of tension in their internal culture. This is an image from the office walls in their headquarters. And when we interviewed their founder last year, he talked about their growth trajectory and the kind of ambition of the business as being a revolutionary act, which in itself is a brilliant kind of story, instantly kind of creates a sense of tension, something to overcome. And so actually one of their core values is around the notion of sabotage. So that sense that they are all kind of trying to introduce and resolve tension in the way that they behave as an organization. So again, a much more dramatic, much more interesting, and very far from dull, as you can see from their office, this story that they're telling to their employees. And it's one that makes an enemy of their competitors. It implies this kind of cause that's so great. It requires their people to behave and think with a very different mindset and a set of behaviors. So a brilliant example of how this kind of tension and drama is as important internally as it is externally in the way that you think about your brand and how it shows up. And you may be thinking that, you know, it's very easy to introduce this tension, to bring a bit of drama if you're the new kid on the block, you're the upstart, you're kind of going up against, you know, the Goliaths in your category. And actually, you know, we would always say that challenger is a mindset. It's not about your state of market. And this rings as true for your ability to kind of insert drama into the stories that you tell. So this is an example from a client that we worked with a couple of years back called Uncle Toby. They are a cereal breakfast brand in Australia. And they were really struggling to keep customers interested in the brand when they brought us on board. And partly that's because the breakfast cereal category was kind of dominated by two narratives, either talking about healthy, tasty, or you were talking about tasty health, none of which really have a kind of sense of drama or much interesting to them. So what they did was they found a much more interesting story by dramatizing the superficiality in the wellness industry. So really kind of introducing that tension around superficiality, getting in the way of customers, people just starting their day in a healthy and enjoyable way. So the work that we did with them was kind of to really help them build a strategy that positioned their brand as a way to overcome this complexity. And they had this lovely phrase they talked about, an otavention, so kind of really being a brand that challenges moments of superficiality in Aussie life. So a brilliant example of how you can find this tension, you know, in any category. It's that kind of appetite to really be challenging something and looking for those moments where you can create a bit more narrative tension and drama. So the question for us to ask, you know, are we just telling our customers a dull story about what we know that they want? Or are we making a choice to dramatize how we're battling the thing that's in their way? So we're all kind of human, as humans, we're all natural born storytellers. But actually really taking a moment to think about what tension we have in our stories is a really brilliant way to move from kind of the risk of dull to something a bit more interesting. So let's say we know who we're for, we know what we want to say to our customers, we're telling our story in a dramatic way. But how do we know what good looks like? Often, you know, as we've talked about, the risk, the kind of loss aversion in us means that we really do need more kind of sense of reassurance. We look around us to measure good. So this kind of next strategic question that we set ourselves is really about, are we setting the right bar? Are we setting the right ambition, or are we just keeping pace with the rest of the category and our competitors? So we're all here hopefully because a bit like this meme, we all want to be more interesting, I hope. We all want to stand out, we all want to kind of go big. But actually this is really hard if all we're doing is just comparing ourselves to the competition, to the others within our category. And using that as a way to work out, you know, where we stand and whether our ambition is right. And actually challengers look beyond their immediate category or competition to set the bar for their ambition. And in doing this, they set their bar much, much higher. So Liquid Death, Toby's mentioned them already, but we love this quote from Mike Cesario, their co-founder, because he talks about kind of setting the bar based on a very different category. The bar isn't just other commercials, it's certainly not other water brands. For Liquid Death, their bar is Netflix comedy specials, films, TV shows, a much noisier world of entertainment and social media. And so you can see from the way that they behave in the world that they really are kind of, you know, they are setting an ambition that is much greater than the competitors around them. And that drives them to make very different choices about what they do. So what kind of bar might we want to set? There's a couple of ways that, you know, we could think about this, but most of them entail us kind of reframing our competitive set, kind of reframing those that we are kind of pegging our ambition to. So it might be a simple way of picking a different category that we're competing in. We interviewed Emilia Christie Miller, who is the founder of Bold Beans. If you don't know Bold Beans, they are a jarred bean company, and they are brilliant. So this is not a plug for them, but they make brilliant beans. But anyway, she told us that you know, for them, they're not competing with other beans. She sees her real competition as avocado toast. So immediately they're looking at kind of where they need to play in different occasions. They're thinking differently about all their touch points. And this sense of kind of setting a higher ambition that goes beyond their immediate competitive set gives them a very different kind of ambition and set of challenges that they're trying to address. It might mean thinking differently about your brand neighborhood, so the other brands you want to be seen around. So this is a great example from Pippin Nut, the peanut butter brand. And they didn't want to be limited by the health foods category. So, you know, they found themselves in a kind of very sort of healthy, nutrient-based category. And actually they raised their ambition and said, we want to be seen as a lifestyle brand. We want to keep the company of people like Nike or Frame, the kind of really luxury premium fitness center. And so they showed up as part of this kind of fitness and outdoor world. And that gave them access to a very different audience. And it really kind of elevated the ambition that they'd set themselves. It might mean looking to a completely different category to set the bar for what good looks like. So this image is of a baseball team called Savannah Bananas. If you haven't heard of them, I highly encourage you to look them up on YouTube. They are incredibly entertaining. And that's because they describe themselves as the greatest show in sport. And instead of trying to be like other baseball teams, they talk about imagining the best possible fan experience. So they take inspiration from the world of dance. They have an in-team choreographer, circus, performing arts. So every show for them is not just a baseball match, it's a spectacle. It's kind of rooted in the crowd participation, and they bring a completely different energy to their games and to their kind of performances. And of course, that means that they're not just a baseball team. They're not just appealing to baseball fans. They talk about themselves as kind of a sellout show. They have a small ground, but they have 500,000 people on their ticket wait list. And they have nearly 9 million TikTok followers, which, by the way, is over 6 times the number of people who follow the New York Yankees. So a brilliant way of looking at a very different category. We'd often call this kind of outlooking, looking outside of your world for different sources of inspiration and points of reference, and using this to set a much higher bar for what their success looks like. So a really kind of good question to ask yourself is, are you setting the bar high enough? And if the answer is no, does that mean that you are naturally excluding some of the ideas that feel bolder and more interesting to you? So we've battled kind of 4 dimensions of dull so far. But as Toby said right at the beginning, none of this matters unless people are paying attention to you. So our final dimension of dull asks whether or not we are denying assumptions or reinforcing preconceptions. So in every category, there is a dominant perception, a set of assumptions that are often considered best practice. So I'm sure if you take the time to have a look at your brand, your kind of world, you'll quickly be familiar with what these might be. And often these assumptions are set by the market leader, they're set by the incumbents, they're things that have existed for a long time, and actually they largely dictate what consumers think and expect of us as brands. And very often they actually dictate what we think we should be as brands. So we have a choice here. We can choose to reinforce these assumptions, but that obviously comes with a risk, because if the whole category is doing that, then that's creating more of the same. It's much harder to cut through, and ultimately it gets a bit dull, right? The other choice we have is that we can choose to cut through, but this will require us to challenge the assumptions that consumers already have about our brand and our category. So this is a quote from Doug Martin, who is the Chief Brand and Disruptive Growth Officer of General Mills. And he says, we are all inundated with a world that's always telling us things. We're always using our brains to follow ahead and fill in the blank that we think is coming. And actually, you know, if you've ever tried to proofread something, this is why we don't really spot typos. We're kind of conditioned to think that we know where things are heading and to see what's next and fill in the blanks ourselves. And so it's only when you surprise people that you can really get them to kind of step out and pay more attention. It's only when something catches us off guard that we break with our assumptions of what we might be expecting to see, and we pay much, much more attention to that. And that's because we are hardwired to respond to the unexpected. So your second dose of neuroscience incoming. Surprise is a really strong kind of neuro alert. So it generates extreme curiosity. Essentially, our brains are kind of trying to work out what's happening. And in doing so, they just pay more attention. And interestingly, actually, that response is addictive. So it's something that we crave. It's something that, our kind of brains enjoy. It really stimulates us. And so ultimately, it's something that can influence our behaviors. So if we want people to pay more attention, a brilliant question and kind of thing that we can explore is, what are the assumptions that we might want to challenge, and how can we do so in a way that surprises people? So it might be an assumption about the context your brand or category is appropriate in. So this is a fantastic example from German doner kebab. So they deny this assumption that kebabs are only good for kind of staggering home after a night out. They talk about doners worthy of the daylight, which is a brilliant line. But it really challenges the preconceptions we might have had about the category, about a kebab, about freshness, about health, about quality. And it forces us to think about whether or not their brand, their product is appropriate at a different time of day. So a brilliant way of kind of surprising people in their advertising and encouraging a different kind of set of assumptions, or challenging the ones that already exist within their category. It might be an assumption about your audience that it's important to challenge. So this brand, Clos de Bois, are a Californian Chardonnay brand, and they wanted to speak to a younger audience. And they did some research, and the consumers that they were after, this younger audience, told them that they wouldn't drink Chardonnay because it was, and I quote, old women's wine. And so this category for them already came with this whole set of assumptions about who was drinking it, the kind of context and occasions that they might be drinking it in, and the image that it would say if you were a person that also drank Chardonnay, that also drank Clos de Bois. And so they saw this as kind of off-putting, but they also saw this as something that wasn't really true or didn't need to be true. So they built this wonderful strategy that was all about challenging and denying the assumptions of who a Chardonnay drinker is in the US. And they did this in a very kind of entertaining way. So this is an example from one of their ad campaigns, where they really celebrate this kind of group of fabulous drinkers and women and men who are kind of an older age, but by no means that's stopping them enjoying life to the very last drop. And interestingly, they have seen huge brand growth, not just with their kind of core audience, but with that younger group who previously saw that this was a product for old women. So really important to kind of challenge some of the assumptions that you might have about your audience, or your potential audience might have about who you are for. You might also be denying an assumption about your product. So the sun cream category, as an example, is a market of kind of creams or spray, maybe oils for the bold. But really, it's a formula that hasn't been challenged for a long time. We're very kind of in tune, and we have clear expectations about what our sun cream is going to look like, and how we're going to experience the product. So in came Vacation Ink. They are a sun cream brand, and they talk about kind of sun cream as a lifestyle category. They talk about it as an enabler, and they talk about kind of leisure enhancing sun cream. So of course, their kind of challenge was to deny some of the assumptions that come with a very serious and functional category in the way that the product's delivered. So this image here is of their classic whip sun cream, which if you haven't seen it, it was a kind of smash hit, breakout hit on TikTok. But essentially, it's delivered in the form of a can that makes it feel more like a foam, a dessert, than it is a sun cream. So as the name suggests, it comes out like kind of whipped cream. So what seems like a novelty has actually been hugely successful for them, because it's really denied some of the assumptions that people had around sun cream. And it was dubbed one of the kind of most popular products on TikTok. Their brand has grown kind of 200% year on year. And it's certainly getting them much more attention than the rest of the competitors in their category. Or simply, you might just be denying an assumption that is based on skewing some of the tropes of your category marketing. So in this example, not all premium brands, spirit brands, need to be brought to you by a slick celeb looking very kind of smug on the side of a lorry. This is a brilliant example that's live at the moment in the UK. This is Ricky Gervais's brand Dutch Barn Vodka. And they deny this kind of assumption that kind of celebrity endorsed alcohol brands are only kind of this sort of smooth and suave exterior in only a way that he can. So lovely kind of phrase here. You know, buying Dutch Barn will make a person rich and happy, and that person is Ricky Gervais. So in doing so, we pay much more attention to a far less expected story. And actually, when you go on to see the bottle and understand about the product, they have a much more interesting story to tell there. They're in a brown bottle against the category. They're made from British apples. So they're really kind of drawing you in with a much less expected story, challenging some of the assumptions you might have had about a vodka brand, and in doing so, getting you to pay much more attention. So our final kind of challenge to you, are we being ignored because we're doing what's expected? Or are we denying our audience's key assumptions in a way that's surprising? So that's almost it from us. I think we've kind of hopefully taken you through some of the causes of dull and some strategic choices that you can make in order to be less dull and to be more interesting. So to wrap up, you know, who you're for and not for is critical. And actually, you know, dividing the world, understanding the audience that you want to be for and who you will not be for as a result is a really clear strategic choice that you can make in order to be less dull, to be more interesting. Knowing what you want to say to your consumers is obviously critical. And as we heard from the examples, actually really amplifying your differences. So in the case of Halo Top, really kind of amplifying the low calorie that they had and sacrificing an overcommit to one thing that can really kind of help you stand out is important. Telling your story in a dramatic way, kind of introducing that tension. And actually we would often talk about this as knowing what you're challenging, knowing what that tension is that your brand is going up against, as being a really critical kind of principle and mindset of a challenger. And of course, this requires you to set a new bar for good. So raising your ambitions so that you're not just looking within your competitors, not just looking within your category, but you're looking at really what you want to be and who your reframed competitive set are. And then finally, getting attention. It's on all of our minds all the time. But denying assumptions and breaking with the expectations of your category is a brilliant way that challengers really enable themselves to get noticed and drive fame. So hopefully, if we follow these rules and we ask these kind of strategic questions and make these choices, together we can kind of fight dull and kind of move forward in a world that's a bit more interesting.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. We're going to do some questions in a minute. We've got some really good ones coming in. I hope we're able to answer them. Just before we do, just to say that, you know, obviously, these are all things and lessons that we sort of apply with our clients. They're all things we can do and questions we can ask of ourselves internally. We also do have an intervention, kind of a 1 or 2 day session that will help take your whole team through this and apply this to your brand. And also it's worth mentioning as well that I think these themes touch upon sort of bigger foundational questions that brands need to be asking themselves. So, you know, do we have big ambitions as a brand, and do we all as a company understand what those things are? So is that demanding of us kind of bravery and sort of more sort of bold decision making? Do we have a clear sense of where growth is going to come from and what that mindset is that will help us sort of achieve that, and what mindset, you know, will that sort of inspire or be aspirational to our customer groups on? And, you know, are we trapping ourselves in the assumptions of our own category at the moment? And can we sort of understand what category we ought to be sort of defining as the one we want to be in? So all of those are quite deep, they're quite strategic. And of course, we do that work with clients as well. That is our bread and butter. But anyway, selling bit over. We've got some really good questions. So just going to start off with one from Meg. She got there in there first. Asking about how we would suggest not being dull when we are sort of restricted with, you know, a category that has sort of quite significant regulation. So the medical category, the pharma category, for example. So I've had a moment to think about that. Hopefully your answer will be better than mine. So I think I'd just say, yes, it is, of course, harder. But it's also harder for your competition as well. So I think, you know, Susie's point about sort of brands tending to sort of set their bar for good by looking at what everyone else within their category is doing means that breaking with that is a huge competitive advantage. So firstly, it's much easier to break with it because the bar is set very low. And I think sort of secondly, I would say that these categories tend to spend a lot of time talking to themselves. They are particularly sort of expert-led categories. They're very technically complicated. So the people who operate in them tend to be quite technically minded. Of course, they have to be. But as a result, they are interested in things that their clients, their patients, for example, often are less interested in. So we did some really, I think, one of the best sort of projects I've ever been involved with, some work with ViiV, GSK's HIV division, a few years ago now, and they were working on a new drug regimen that they were about to launch in the market, and they were trying to understand how to communicate it to their audience. And we spent a lot of time with ViiV talking to patient groups. And one of the things that really stuck out was the way that the category, the industry, thought about drugs, about sort of HIV medication, and how patients thought about it. And the category was dazzled by the technical sophistication that medical science had achieved over the last few decades in treating HIV. And of course, patients were as well, but patients were also really concerned by the general trends. And if the HIV category, as you'll probably know, has essentially succeeded by adding new drugs on top of existing drugs. So we're at now 3 drug regimens with plenty of additional sort of booster compounds attached. And obviously patients were very pleased to no longer be handed a death sentence. They were genuinely, obviously, very, very, very pleased with that. But also, they had a sense that the more things that the category kept layering on top of the treatment regimens were creating more side effects. And nobody was really talking about side effects, and they didn't really feel able to talk to their healthcare provider about side effects either, because they would feel sort of ungrateful for doing so. I'm not going to die now, but I'm having really bad headaches or really bad nausea. So actually, that sort of gave ViiV the realization that they had a different conversation they could have with their patients, with their end user, and the different conversation they could have with HCPs, unlocking a whole new relationship that hadn't really been present before. And it gave them a really interesting way to frame what it was they were doing. They weren't just seeking to cure HIV and make it a livable, treatable condition. They were in fact looking to remove all of the sort of the unnecessary treatments that had been sort of built up around it. And they were actually trying to sort of do more with less. That was their ambition. And that completely changed the way they thought about what they were trying to achieve as an organization. And it completely changed the way they spoke to their patients, to HCPs, and to buyers as well. So quite a radical shift. And that came from just having deeper conversations with patients and looking for an insight rather than just, a sort of a mass observation. Hopefully that's bought you enough time.
That has, thank you. No, I think another kind of highly regulated industry like finance is interesting. So I think a brand that's really interesting at the moment is Monzo, and I think they've come out with some really interesting work recently. So we talked about drama, and I think there's perhaps a misconception that drama needs to be kind of big and showy and dramatic, but really when we say drama, it's about the tension. And actually their recent work is dramatic, but it talks about the tension that consumers feel around money, and it introduces a monster of that kind of suffocating sense that lots of people have when they think about money. And actually that's in a highly regulated industry, but which is very difficult to get people to switch accounts and bank accounts, but they're able to kind of create a very different connection to people and kind of think about how they really resonate in a way that's very much more emotional and tells a very clear story without really talking about some of their products. So I think that sense of tension exists in lots of categories. And I think, the drama doesn't need to be the way of delivering it, but really understanding what you're challenging and what's wrong is a really good starting point to kind of, to think about that even in much more regulated industries.
Great. Got another good question from Susan, and another one from Clement that I think essentially speak the same point, so I'll try and bundle them together. So Susan asks, so IKEA, is a brand, a mass market brand, very successful mass market brand, speaking explicitly for the many people, and it manages to stay interesting. Sorry for mangling your question. How do they do that? And Clement is asking, to what extent does this sort of targeting of a more niche audience contradict what we learned from Byron Sharp and How Brands Grow in terms of targeting the masses, and the biggest opportunity for brands lies in light users. So I don't think it does, and I think those two questions are obviously very closely related. So just a quick example from, it's quite a well-established brand, but I think it's a quite well-established example, but I think it's a really good one. So Hendrick's Gin, one of the sort of breakaway success brands of the last sort of decade, had sort of, I think, record-breaking sort of growth in the spirits category. transformed the way, gin is viewed or was viewed in this country, moving it from, your grand's drink essentially to something again that was kind of trendy and contemporary. Now, when they launched, they did so with a radically different sort of packaging concept. So, the black apothecary bottle. They had the mindset that they used. So Stephen Grass, one of the brains behind the brand, talked about his sort of aspirational mindset, the thing we were talking about, being the unusualist. Now that was, someone who lived in sort of Hackney in East London, was a hipster, was into Jules Verne, Victoriana, that type of thing. Now that was about 10 or 15 people in reality. That was not sort of a demographic you could sell to and be successful. But because they used that mindset to create a brand world, they used that as the kind of, the design target, the litmus test for what was good and what was not. They created a really interesting and compelling brand that, I buy into, my mum buys into, and neither of us are kind of Hackney hipsters. And I think, in their consumer testing, when they were laying these packaging concepts out in front of people, Stephen Grass would say that, in fact, the black bottle, the small apothecary style bottle they went for, was the least liked. But it was the one that everyone spoke about. So it was the one they decided to lean into because everyone was ignoring the more traditional packaging concepts. So when we're talking about an aspirational mindset, we are explicitly not talking about a demographic target. We're not talking about a niche brand. We're talking about finding what all of those people aspire to be more like, and then designing a brand world, brand story, the messaging for that aspirational design target. So it has a much sort of broader appeal. Harley Davidson talk about their mindset being the last American cowboy, essentially the Hell's Angel, that kind of character. That's about 4% of their sales, but the other sort of 96% of their sales come from people who want to buy into a little bit of that idea, sort of on a Saturday when they've got some time to sort of hit the road. So we're not really talking about a demographic target. We're talking about a mindset, a design target.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of brilliant examples. Another great one that we've mentioned today is Liquid Death. So everything they do speaks to, a very kind of specific sort of subculture around, whether that's skateboarding or whether that's kind of heavy metal. But they're one of the world's fastest growing water brands. I think they've just been valued at over $1 billion. So I think that distinction between the choice you're making and who you're building the brand for is very focused. But as Toby says, that doesn't exclude others in terms of how you actually kind of where your sales come from. So I think making that distinction is important, but having that singularity of who's at the core is really, really important. Yeah. That's a great question.
And sometimes it's an artificial dichotomy. So to go back to your question, Susan, about IKEA, I mean, they talk about being for the wonderful every day, and the mindset that would appeal to are the people that they want to win over. But they also talk about being for the many, and sort of implicit within that, to the point Susie made about having a narrative tension, is that there are also a few. So you've already divided the world into kind of the many and the few, and you're saying we will stand, we will a democratizer, standing on the side of the many against elitist access to kind of good design, which was the kind of foundational thought behind them. But even then, even within that, their more recent campaign where they sort of had sort of real life shots of what it's actually like in your home when you got the flu or something and you're being sick into a bucket. That's deeply polarizing communication. Not everyone will like that. I don't think my gran would like that necessarily. So they are still within that sort of artificial dichotomy, still saying we're for some people who get this and who like this and recognize the real world here. We're not for those with pretension perhaps who pretend that everything's perfect. So there's always a way of dividing the world, even if you're a mass market brand. I had a question from Diego about how we would sell these ideas into the C-suite. Do you want to dive in first on this one? Unfairly.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. So sorry, it was so how do we sell?
How you would sell this concept into the C-suite? I think the first thing to say is we're hoping this does it. I mean, this is still early days. We're working with all of our partners to make this data more robust. But I think the aim is firstly to say, look, you can be dull. If you are, an incumbent, if you have deep pockets, perfectly fine. If that's what we want to continue doing, we can carry on doing that. Lots of brands do that, with some success. But if we have big ambitions, if you C-suite, have been set some really, really tough objectives, then would we not like to make our sort of marketing budget twice as effective rather than halving it? We absolutely don't want to halve it. We want to make it twice as effective, twice the bang for our buck. So firstly, having honest assessment of whether or not we are in fact being dull. and how we might be more interesting, and then exploring how much or how brave we're willing to be in order to receive those benefits, being more interesting.
And I think beyond the kind of the choices, I think the way in which you make those choices is important. So, you know, lots of the way that we work is not kind of coming to a conclusion and selling it in. So actually, we talked at the beginning about the idea of path dependency, that, you know, a good behavior becomes best practice, becomes locked in practice, and actually it's really difficult for an organization to shift away from that. So often the solution may make sense, and being, you know, the cost and the data behind it may make sense, but actually the journey and the story that needs to be told along the way to help people kind of let go of some of the things that they have always held to be true, or let go of some of the assumptions that they've made around what, you know, best practice should look like, is as important. So I think, you know, I think hopefully some of the data that we're starting to look at gives some of the you know, the robust numbers that can help with the financial conversations. But I think as much of that, the kind of the story and bringing that group into the journey is always really, really important.
Probably got time for a couple more questions. So we have one from Chris asking, how important is raising the bar and shooting for Netflix level entertainment? I think we say, firstly, obviously, not every brand is going to be able to achieve Netflix level entertainment. Not every brand has to. I think the simplest answer is, you know, the old adage, you don't have to sort of run faster than the tiger. You just have to run faster than the guy next to you. So I think it is certainly important to raise the bar. Exactly where you set that, I think, really probably should depend on a really good understanding of your target audience. What are they thinking about when they think about your brand?
Yeah, and I think that I think possibly what's behind that quote is as Toby says, understanding that their audience really care about being entertained, and they want kind of, you know, they want that sort of the latest content and that premium, you know, production value. So for Liquid Death, and I think that was the example, Netflix level entertainment is the bar that they should be raising to, but that might look very different for your consumers depending on what really matters to them. So I think, yeah, I think that's a great question, but understanding the other stories and things that they are paying attention to, not just within advertising, but, you know, more broadly, I think is an important kind of context to think about the bar that you might set around communications, for example. I
mean, Bold Beans is a really good example.
Yeah.
So they're saying, you know, their true competitor is, you know, avocado on toast is more interesting sort of breakfast, sort of brunch, sort of alternatives. Well, that's a great, really good example, really good bar to set. It's not other mainstream sort of, you know, beans brands. It's the people doing really interesting sort of culturally contemporary things around that meal occasion. That's your bar. So you only need to go and look at them and say, well, that's the world I want to live in, to have a sense of how you need to pitch yourself. You know, also the Pip and Nut, they didn't want to be associated with either the sort of, you know, the trashy American version of peanut butter that might have existed at the time, or they didn't want to be associated with, you know, Health Nuts and Holland and Barrett. They wanted to be associated with where their customer was turning up. You know, yoga, sort of East London yoga studios, or Nike sort of Run London. That's where they wanted to be. That was the brand neighborhood they were setting themselves. So not pitching yourself at sort of Netflix level, but understanding what interesting looks like to your target audience in the occasion in which you want to be sort of consumed or be sort of interacted with. That should be the bar you set yourselves, not other brands within your category. Probably time for one more. So these are being fed to us, by the way. We're not reading through and choosing. It's been pre-selected. So Sophie has a really good question. What would your advice be on how to stand out within a category where to some degree all players are already challengers, i.e. sort of craft beer or the plant-based alternatives? I've had a second longer, so do you want me to buy some time? I'll do the less good answer, and then Susie will do the more interesting one. So I think, firstly, we say, of course, in some ways it's tougher, but it's amazing how quickly a new sort of status quo asserts itself. So you only have to think about the craft beer category. It's, you know, been around probably in its current incarnation for about 10 years, maybe. Most things are now 10 years ago to me. It's possibly been a little bit longer, but very, very quickly within the first few years, it had established a new look and feel and sort of, you know, semiotic sort of code, and everyone now plays into that. So quite quickly, you've got a new sea of sameness to extract yourself from and to show yourself in contrast to. So I think, yes, in some ways it can be trickier because it feels fresher to us, but I think given the customer just is never really paying that much attention, I think very quickly, I mean, the human capacity to find things boring is remarkably resilient. So very quickly people will just go, that's what it looks like now. And that's no longer as exciting as it was to me when it was the first brand on the scene doing something. So there's almost always, I think, an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think going back to some of the examples that Toby had around the idea of amplifying your differences, I think at the heart of most brands is something that, you know, when really exaggerated, can be genuinely unique. And I think if you can find a way to combine that with something in the category, and maybe that's something that is emerging as from that kind of sea of sameness and all those brands looking the same, that just isn't serving consumers well, then I think that's where some of the kind of cutting through that sense that everyone else is trying to find the same thing as you. I think starting with that sense of, you know, what sits at the heart of the brand and what could be something you can amplify as a really compelling difference immediately will help you to kind of find a different path to some of the rest of the category who are clamoring for the same consumers or contexts or occasions.
Much better answer.
Had longer.
We've now officially been told we're out of time. So thank you really much. Thank you very much for your questions. Apologies if we haven't answered yours. If you would like to send them to us on LinkedIn directly, we will respond to them in person if we're able to do so. If we can find an answer. Otherwise, we'll try and track you down and answer them if we can't. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And do get in touch if anything we've talked about is interesting or relevant to you. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, everyone.